Now we're going to cover how to do prediction with Stata. In particular, we're going to talk about how to use a simple linear regression model to make a predicted value, a confidence interval, and a prediction interval. So what we're going to do is I'm going to use example 1 data. That was the ACT predicting freshman GPA. So again, that's the data set you can find on Blackboard under computer example 1 for simple linear regression. So I will quickly just run the regression. Regress. We're going to predict GPA from ACT scores. Okay, and again, if you want to see the details and all this, and then how to check all these assumptions, all the diagnostics, just look at the documentation for example 1. So that gives a lot of detail there, and a lot of and gives the annotated output as well. But this particular video is going to cover how to do 3 things: produce a point estimate, or a predicted value or expected value for a given value of the independent variable. Then we're going to compute a confidence interval, and then a prediction interval. So as you can see here, that's the we do have to run the regression command first to be able to do these things, because we have to have the model in place. So now let's say that we wanted to I'll just follow along with what I had written in the documentation for this example. So let's say that we wanted to get a predicted GPA from an ACT score of 22. Well, first thing we do is, of course, we'd have to run the regression model and get that in the memory. But then after that, it's fairly straightforward. We just type the command adjust, and then we tell it what value of the independent variable we're looking to make a prediction for. So the name of the independent variable is ACT, and we want to see what happens for a score of 22. Okay. So it computes that for us, and it gives us the estimate of 2.91, roughly, which means that the conditional mean for the GPAs for that conditional population where ACT is 22 is expected to be 2.91. And so we could use that as a point estimator for the conditional mean or for any individual. It's just a point estimate, though it's most likely wrong. It's probably the best single guess we could make, but virtually always wrong, but hopefully to a very minor degree. So that's a point estimator. But now we would probably want to use a confidence interval. That's usually a little more useful. So what would be the 95% confidence interval for the conditional mean of GPA for the population or the subpopulation of everyone that got a 22 on the ACT? Okay, well, we would just use the same command, start off the same way, adjust ACT equals 22, then comma, because we're going to add an option, that option being CI. Okay, so we get similar output. So we get the same predicted value, but we also get the confidence interval. It's LB and UB, so for lower bound and upper bound. And if you don't specify a percentage, it will automatically do 95% by default. You can set this if you want to do, say, the 99% confidence interval. If you want to do that, you could do that if you leave CI there, and then you put level and then 99. So then it produces, again, the same point estimator, because that's where the line gives us that value back, so that's going to be the same. However, now it's a little wider because we asked for the 99%, so if we're wanting to be that sure, we're going to have to extend the bounds of our confidence interval out a little bit. So if you notice, compared to what it was for the 95%, it's a little bit wider. So this one drops down to 2.6, and this one jumps up to 3.12. Didn't change that much. So anyway, if you want to be more confident, you're going to have to expand the range of the interval, or go get more data. But assuming that we didn't go get more data, if we're wanting to do that with what we have, that's how you do it. Okay, so that's the confidence interval. And let's go back to that confidence interval just at 95%. I'm going to redo that. You know what, I'm just going to clear the screen. And okay. So here again, this is just a replay of the 95% confidence interval. And so how would we interpret that? Well, there's a few different ways. The roughest basic way to interpret that is to say that we're 95% confident that the conditional mean for GPA at an ACT of 22 is between 2.76 and 3.07. So for that conditional distribution, that conditional population where ACT scores are 22, we could say we're roughly 95% confident that the mean GPA is somewhere between those two numbers. That's not a completely technically correct interpretation, but that's generally how people will talk about it in their findings, and it gets the point across. The more accurate interpretation, which really isn't necessary for homework or anything for us, but if you want to talk about it in a more precise way, you could say that if we were to repeat this study numerous times in the exact same way and produce a confidence interval in the same way with new data, we'd have we'd roughly capture that conditional mean of GPA at ACT equals 22 95% of the time. So that's a long roundabout way of saying pretty much what we said earlier, but that is a more technically correct interpretation of those things. But to say simply that we're 95% confident that the conditional mean of GPA at the condition of ACT equals 22 is somewhere in these bounds of 2.76 and 3.07. Okay, so now that just leaves the prediction interval. Okay, well, let's bring up our old command, and the only thing we need to do here, if we want the prediction interval, we leave the CI on there. We would just tell it, we'd add one last little thing, STDF, for that stands for the standard error of forecast. In other words, we would need to use somewhat wider margins of error, wider bounds for our interval. And forecast is another word that means predict. So we can call it a prediction interval, you can call it a forecast interval if you want. But that's what that little F on the end there is going to tip you off that this is the standard error of forecast. In other words, this is how we're going to get our prediction interval. So once you have that in there, just click enter. And so then we get, again, same point estimator, 2.91. That's always the same. Well, for our ACT of 22. Again, it repeats up here what the input value was for the independent variable. And then it gives us the prediction interval here. Again, with the lower bound and upper bound. Now, if you notice, this is quite a bit wider than what it was up here for the confidence interval, because that confidence interval is trying to predict where the mean would, the conditional mean would be. prediction interval is a little trickier. We're asking quite a bit of the data. We're trying to produce an interval that would capture roughly 95% of the people that would be randomly sampled from this conditional distribution where everyone has an ACT score of 22. So we're trying to predict just the next random person that comes along with an ACT of 22. What would their GPA be? It's kind of a difficult prediction to make, so it's obviously going to be a little less precise than predicting a mean of a group of people. That's a little more stable. So we get this larger interval. In this case, it's 2.33 up to roughly 3.5. So to interpret that one, we'd simply say that we're 95% confident that the next person to be sampled from the conditional distribution where ACT equals 22, we're 95% confident that that person's GPA would be a GPA within this interval. Again, that's the rough way of saying it. And let me say it one more time just to make sure I'm doing this clearly. For the next person that we sampled from the conditional distribution where ACT scores are 22, their GPA has a 95% chance of being within this interval of 2.33 and 3.5. Again, that's the rough way of saying it. The technically correct way would be saying if we were to repeat this process with new data over and over and produce a prediction interval of this size, or compute a prediction interval here at ACT equals 22, 95% of the time we would capture that person's GPA. So that's a roundabout, more statistical way of getting at this idea. But really, you can think of it that you can be 95% confident that any person selected from that subpopulation where ACT is 22 should have a GPA within that range.